They say they're my bank. They've confirmed my postcode and my account number. They say they've spotted suspicious activity on my account. They could be my bank. Now they've asked me to move my money to a safe account they've set up. That tells me they are not my bank. My money? My info? I don't think so.
A genuine bank will never contact you asking you to move your money to a safe account. Take 5.
This is a Global Original Podcast. Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Full Disclosure, a project designed chiefly to allow me, James O'Brien, to spend a little bit more time than is ordinarily available with people that I've long admired, and that is a category into which the journalist and broadcaster and former Member of Parliament, Matthew Parris, slots all too easily. Matthew, thank you for joining us. I've just remembered as I do that introduction that, of course, you present Great Lives yourself, and I'd like you to think of Full Disclosure as a great life for people who are still with us.
Great Lives is for heroes. I'm not a hero.
Well, you're a hero of mine, actually, and I don't have many left. I certainly don't have many that have ever sat on Conservative benches, but we're getting ahead of ourselves.
That was a long time ago.
Indeed it was, chronologically and possibly ideologically as well. But let's begin at the beginning. You were born in South Africa to English parents. Siblings, 3 brothers, 2 sisters. A sort of life that no longer exists, really. Was it a colonial idyll?
Not really, no. Like Tony Blair's family, my parents emigrated. They meant to emigrate for good after the Second World War. That's why we were in South Africa and the young Tony Blair was in Australia.
Of course, yes.
And in both cases, the parents thought better of it and came back. But no, my father was an engineer. He was a power engineer, selling electric wires and cables. In 1948, I think, the Nats, that's the white apartheid, Afrikaner-dominated party, came to power in South Africa. My parents saw which way things were going and decided they didn't want it for a future. So my first birthday was on a ship off the port of Mombasa on our way back to England.
On your way back to Blighty. So that answers a question that I have about, we're jumping ahead of ourselves, but Brexit's going to come up soon enough. You were not one of those children that grew up with a slightly mythologised idea of England, which, when one looks at the childhoods of some of the more prominent Brexiters, there is a sense that an England that never existed is the thing that they're trying to regain.
I've never understood that picture of England at all. I've always loved England, but not that golden age. We left when I was 4 years old, and back to Africa. Then this time Rhodesia, and we were all over the place.
You really were, weren't you? You ended
Zambia,
up in Catalonia
Malawi.
for a while.
Oh, that came much later. I mean, we got Cyprus to come.
Agreed.
Oh, yes, I've missed Cyprus out. We were 4 years in Cyprus, selling wires and cables all over the world, and Jamaica, and finally Catalonia. Yes, yes.
Were you secure? I mean, or
completely.
You didn't feel, you've never come across as a man who felt rootless. So
your
parents managed to provide a deep sense of belonging, despite the fact that you didn't actually belong anywhere.
A strong family is the only thing that matters, and you could be insecure in one place or secure in a nomadic existence if you have a strong family. I'm the eldest of 6 children, and we always stuck together.
Do you still?
Yes, all of us.
Strong, proper relationships and...
Yes.
Sort of put everything else into perspective sometimes, don't they?
Yes.
There's a depth and a knowledge, a familiarity that means you don't have to explain yourself quite often.
And I speak exactly as my mother does. My mother was a radio broadcaster.
Really?
She was in 1955, I think, when we were in Cyprus, and she worked for the Forces Broadcasting Corporation that was a British colony at that time, suffering a terrorist uprising from the Greek Cypriots. And my mother was a radio presenter, and she was voted by the troops Miss Pussy Voice 1955.
So just for younger listeners, we should probably explain. Words evolve in much,
yes, I think so.
Much the same way that political parties do. So, well, that makes sense, actually, because I've always... you have mellifluous tones, and yet you've never really come across as a natural performer. You're not a show-off, are you?
I think we're all show-offs in some ways, but not in my way of talking. No, I have exactly the right voice, I think, if you needed recorded messages for the incidents of a nuclear attack, I have the voice to say there is nothing to be afraid of. Get under the table and whitewash your windows. All will be well.
It's like Betjeman's haberdashery department at Peter Jones in audio terms, isn't it? Nothing bad could ever happen here.
No.
So where did ambition appear then to the young Matthew Parris? It's a sort of peripatetic but profoundly secure and happy childhood. At some point, adulthood must have beckoned, and you'd have.
It came long before adulthood. I'm afraid to say, exactly like Boris Johnson, from as early as I could remember, I wanted to be king of the world. At least when I was 4, probably earlier.
Why, if that's not a silly question?
Well, it just seemed natural.
It's the only job you could think of that was commensurate with your
world
talent.
Leadership just comes naturally to me. Well, it never actually came, but it was always my first job application, I wrote when I was about 10, I think, and I wrote to the Foreign Office saying that I wanted to be governor of a British colony, and what career should what education should I go through to be a governor of a British colony. And I had a very nice letter back from the Foreign Office saying that by the time I was ready to be a governor, there wouldn't be any colonies to be governor of. So then I thought I would like to be British ambassador in Washington or something like that. And I did get into the Foreign Office, and then that didn't work out. Then I thought I'd like to be Prime Minister. So I got into Parliament, and that didn't work out. Then I thought I'd like to be a television star, a sort of another Andrew Marr-like figure, and I took on a TV programme, and that didn't work out. So slowly, my sights have lowered, but they've taken a distinct upward turn with this podcast with you, James.
Yes. What did all those ambitions have in common, then, apart from a desire to tell other people what to do?
Being in charge, I think.
Was that really a big thing? Is that the big brother in you? Is that the syndrome?
I'm afraid so, yes.
That's big brother with small consonants.
Yes, I say that with no pride, but yes, I think that's probably right.
And the one thing I found fascinating when I was reading up about the bits, much about you that I didn't know, was this early reading of Animal Farm, which now makes more sense than it did before. You felt really the pigs got quite a bad press.
I was sent to a school in the Vumba in southern Rhodesia because I was having a very difficult relationship with my school's teacher in a state school there. So I was kind of sent away to this boarding school for difficult children. And
was it called that? Or was that just the...
No, it was just called Vumba Heights, right, but it was basically for children that were encountering difficulties.
Oh, dear.
There was only one bookshelf in the whole school, and so I just read all the books on it. I read Little Women and got all excited about the lace that they were buying for their dresses. Then I saw a book called Animal Farm, and I thought, great, I love animals. So I read Animal Farm. I didn't know what communism was. I didn't know who George Orwell was. And I read it as a story about animals that took over the farm. And I immediately found myself in sympathy with the pigs, because the pigs just they got to grips and sorted everything out. And I could see the other animals were all very nice, but they were just hopeless. It was useless. It was chaotic. I was on the side of the pigs from first to last. So for me, that the book had a kind of happy ending because the pigs were in charge and they made peace with the humans. That's probably why I became a conservative.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because it's a charitable reading of conservative ideology, that it's paternalistic. Right? Yeah. That's what we're talking about.
Yes, well, it is. People need their heads banging together sometimes.
And you wrote, an admiration for the pig's intelligence and sense of order dawned in me.
Yes. Completely. And also an appreciation of the complete chaos that you would get if you just let everybody be themselves.
Yes. Gosh. We've hit our first profundity.
Not particularly.
Well, I think we probably have. You ended up at Cambridge after this slightly meandering school career. When and this is a question that doesn't invite modesty, but when did you realise you were clever?
Gosh. No one's ever asked me that question before, probably because no one's ever thought I was clever.
I said the question wouldn't invite modesty. If you're good at football, it becomes clear pretty early, doesn't it? If you're good at cricket, if you're good at...
I think I must have realised quite early, because my father witheringly always called me Clever Sticks. And
witheringly, because he was a doer.
He was a doer, and he thought I was a show-off.
Okay.
And the most stinging reprimand that I ever had, which I had repeatedly from my father, was stop making an exhibition of yourself. But actually, if I had, I wouldn't have had the career that I've had.
No, I mean, you have to put your hand up occasionally, don't you, to get noticed. But
I think actually, James, that I'm not as clever as I think, if you know what I mean. I have always thought I was quite a bright spark.
Yes.
But I'm so often wrong. And sometimes I find myself just in intellectual speed lagging behind the people around me. And I have a younger brother, Roger, who's 16 months younger than me, who is, and this is not false modesty, he is really clever.
Right.
He's always been clever. He's always been much cleverer than me. But he has no ambition. I have all the ambition and perhaps less of the raw material.
Are we conflating quick thinking and deep thinking dangerously here? He might be a quicker thinker than you, but...
No, he's a deep thinker. I'm quick-witted.
Yes.
I'm quick-witted. Really? But I can't... when I tried to do, for instance, mathematics for A-level, I'd been very good up to O-level. I hit calculus and I just couldn't get it. And mathematician friends tell me that calculus is a good indication of the barrier.
Separates the men from the boys.
Yes,
the men from the boys, so to
that's
speak.
right.
So, you arrive at Cambridge then. Was it a full...
Via Swaziland.
Well,
I was at school in Swaziland.
Yes, via the Waterford Kamlaba United World College.
Yeah, it is now.
Just
it wasn't
outside
at UWC
Mbabane.
then. But the point about that school was it was a multiracial school.
Right.
My parents didn't like segregation and the colour bar and all the rest. We were in Rhodesia, which wasn't nearly as bad as South Africa, but it was bad. And they wanted me to go to a school with all races. So that's how I ended up in Swaziland.
And would that have marked them apart among their peers at the time? That
Oh, yes. Yes, no, my mother was a great campaigner for African education in Rhodesia. I have the photograph, or rather I don't. I have the front page of the Rhodesia Herald with a big blank in it because we had censorship in those days.
Gosh.
And her protest outside the Parliament with our gardener's little boy Amos and my little sister Belinda, each 5 or 6 years old. Belinda holding a placard saying, "I have a future." Amos holding a placard saying, "I have no future," was the front page of the Rhodesia Herald, but the whole thing was blanked so that the paper just printed a white space there. And my mother was very brave.
Well, clearly.
Is very brave.
And she was putting herself at risk doing this.
Well, of general censure and disapproval from other white people, yes.
But you wouldn't have a knock on the door in the night or anything like that. It was
I think we were being followed by the intelligence services in Rhodesia. There were quite a lot of quite dodgy characters on what you might call the liberal side, and there were some real communists and agitators. Yes,
There's no shortage of that. But your mother, a woman of fairly pure principle, so
yeah, the
idea would be, this is my duty to do.
Also, besides being a broadcaster, she was a school teacher, so she really believed in education, and she'd started, along with other white women in our suburb, a school for the children of African servants. The African servants lived on the premises of their masters and mistresses, as we used to call it, and had nowhere to send their children to school. So Mum started a school along with others, and Ian Smith, the then Prime Minister, closed all the schools down.
Wow. Your notion of hierarchy then is intellectual, because growing up where you grew up and arriving at the conclusion you arrived at with Animal Farm, it could have been much uglier.
Yes, yeah.
But it clearly wasn't, because of your interactions and because of your personality and
my parents,
your mother and father's influence.
Yes.
When did you become conscious of proper racism then? Presumably at a very young age.
No, not really.
Okay.
In Rhodesia, when I was about 10 or 11, and I had an African friend, and I said, let's go in for a cup of coffee at a little cafe that was called the Flower Pot.
Yes.
Down near the Meikles Hotel, and we went in and they said, sorry, Africans are not allowed in here. And it had never actually hit me quite as hard. Of course, if you were African, it would have hit you much harder, much earlier. But as a white boy, it hadn't hit me, and that's when it first hit me.
Good grief. How did you process it? How did you make sense of it?
I felt humiliated and embarrassed for my friend. And I had seen in practice what I had only talked about in theory before.
I'm going to jump ahead a bit and then come back to Cambridge, because you joined the Commons in 79, at a time when the Conservative Party, certainly some corners of the Conservative Party, would have been a little bit closer to the proprietor of that cafe than they were to your sense of outrage and shock.
Yes.
I mean, were you dealing with moral quandaries then, or were you clear about what you believed? And
I was clear about what I believed, and I was also clear that a very large and I think the important and worthwhile part of the Conservative Party believed what I did, but there was a strong rearguard action, you're quite right, going on. I had worked for Margaret Thatcher as a clerk in her office when she was leader of the opposition, dealing with her letters from the general public, and there were an awful lot of Conservative voters who thought that Britain should have gone to Ian Smith's support and helped him in his fight against what they saw as the terrorists. So I was aware of that strain. But Margaret Thatcher wouldn't have anything to do with it. She was all kinds of things, but she really was not a racist. She really didn't believe
No, I wasn't, actually, for my own record, I wasn't suggesting that she was.
No, you weren't. Indeed, you weren't. But I found that she wasn't, or I wouldn't have wanted to work for her.
And that could provide you with the reassurance you needed about other things that might have been going on in her party, because it was by then very much her party.
Yes.
So back to Swaziland, you applied to Cambridge. I don't have a sense of you being desperate to escape then, given what you've said about your childhood and about your schooling. There was no real sense of this being a promised land to which you were destined to return. But
no,
you must
but
have
it was
a lot riding on your Cambridge application.
If you're a British expatriate abroad, I'm sure it's the same today as it was then. You always think of England as home. Or Britain as home, and we always thought of Britain as home, although we didn't own any property here, and I was just brought up to think of Britain as my homeland, so I was interested to go back. I didn't have any sort of great yearning, but I did want to go to Cambridge.
Why? Why Cambridge?
Why Cambridge? Because it was the best.
Yes, fair enough. Short answer.
I was quite surprised when I got back to Britain, because I thought, I've lived all my life, nearly all my life, in Africa, where you have two classes of people. You have us, the boss race, the whites, and then you have, of whom there are a few 100,000. And then you have, as you did then, 3 million black people in southern Rhodesia, and you don't know most of them. They are, as it were, the underclass. I thought Britain is going to be different. It was in some ways, but I have found it wasn't entirely different. I found that there is the upper middle class in Britain, and there is the media class of which you and I have become part. And we kind of all know each other, and we kind of keep bumping into each other. And I go to dinner parties and I find that my friends are lots of other people's friends. And then there's this huge Britain out there that I don't know in the sense of being part of. So I found that the colonial upbringing that I'd had did not transpose too badly to the class system in the United Kingdom.
So different compartments, but plenty of compartmentalisation.
Absolutely, yes.
What class did you see yourself as then, as you sort of absorbed this?
I would have started seeing myself as middle class and slowly moved to seeing myself as upper middle class.
As a result of just what you were seeing and encountering, or as a result of your own
and the Cambridge education and the doors it opened.
Yes, of course,
to me.
And did you throw yourself into life at Cambridge?
I was a bit lonely at first.
Yes.
White society in Africa was, if you were white, very warm and welcoming, and even with our funny views on race, I always found people immediate and natural. I came to England and found everyone rather cold, and you would talk to someone in a railway carriage and they would look at you as if you were a bit strange. And there was one young man who did talk to me in a railway carriage, and I thought, how nice, someone at last talks to me. And then at the end, it turned out he was a Christian, and he was trying to recruit me to his gospel group. So I realized it was my soul.
He was interested in
so I found England at first a bit cold, and then after a year at Cambridge, I didn't. So that probably means I've become cold like all the rest.
Well, or that you'd warmed up everything around. It could be one or the other. I mean, how lonely?
No, I wasn't very lonely.
So there was no prospect of quitting or anything?
No. I was a bit isolated. And I wasn't very good at philosophy, which was the first part of my degree and was going to be the second part. I got an upper second, but that wasn't good enough for me. And I switched to law, And I found law very easy, and I still find law very easy. It's a particular kind of intelligence you need for law, and it doesn't mean you're going to be intelligent at anything else, but it's a kind of abstract reasoning that some people have and some don't, and I've always found the law an absolute cinch.
Is it the intellectual equivalent of taking things apart in order to work out how they work, even if you wouldn't necessarily be able to put them back together again?
And of finding underlying principles that link apparently disparate sets of facts.
Yes, well, there's a little glimpse of the future the future held for you, although at that point you would have had no idea, of course. So you didn't even want to be a lawyer particularly.
No, and I never wanted to be a lawyer.
So you saw law very much as a discipline, an academic, an intellectual discipline.
Yeah.
And you took a first, which was good enough.
Yes, that was good enough.
Did you have much of a social life for your second and third years?
I had a small group of friends, and we were the state school boys, which was in those days mostly the grammar school boys.
Okay.
I was an honorary grammar school boy because I hadn't been to a British public school.
No.
And
were you conscious of that? I mean,
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Again, it's an odd apprenticeship. Except it isn't, is it? I think understanding Margaret Thatcher is a key part of understanding your conservatism, because the party of grandees and public school boys, again, was not the party that Margaret Thatcher led.
You're absolutely right.
Right. I never knew that about you.
And that was true even at Clare College in Cambridge. The public school boys, they wore dressing gowns and they sort of stuck together.
Carried teddy bears around.
Yes.
In the worst examples. But you made good pals. I mean, you
very good pals, and some remained so.
You're a member of the Liberal Club.
Yes, I joined the Liberals and the Conservatives at the same time.
Like Pascal's wager, is it? In political terms.
Yes. Yeah. The Liberals were nicer, but they didn't seem to me seriously interested in power.
Plus a change, eh?
Yes.
But what do you mean by nicer? You just mean sort of compassionate or generous?
Yeah, they were genuine. Okay. They were, most of them, not elbowing for position within the society or club or whatever it was called. The Conservative QCA, which I didn't join, I joined a sort of fringe Conservative group, but QCA was all about cravats and sherry parties and who's going to be president of the union, and I never had any time for that.
Have you read Enemies of Promise, Cyril Connolly's Enemies of Promise? He has this thing called the theory of permanent adolescence. Yeah. I went to public school, but not from the kind of background that encouraged dressing gown wearing during the day or anything like that. And he writes about how the experiences undergone by the boys, and he says the great public schools because he went to Eton, but that's 40 years before you were at Cambridge or more. He says the experiences were so intense as to arrest their development and leave them forever, really, in sort of thrall to the honours boards and the prefects' ties. And I until relatively recently, I never really understood that.
It's a very interesting idea,
isn't it?
Certainly, if you hang around one of the Pall Mall clubs and hear the old gents talking there, I see what he means about arrested development. I mean, it's quite pleasant. It's quite lovable.
Yes.
But it is sort of juvenile in a way.
Stuntiness. The reports that Johnson would send messages to Cameron when Cameron was in Downing Street saying, I might be able to help you with this. Queen's scholars know stuff, Yeah. So even then, 30 years after leaving school, the petty point scoring. But as you say, I say petty, but it is actually quite...
Yeah.
In a sense, it's quite amusing and charming as well.
Yeah. Once you know the lingo and you can be sort of part of it, it's quite nice.
So you never felt chippy then in these circumstances? A lot of people might have done.
I never felt chippy because I generally sort of managed to get to where I wanted to go, and won whatever respect I wanted to get. So I think chippiness often comes with a feeling of failure. I never had a feeling of failure, but what I did develop, and this is kind of quite contrary to Orwell and all the rest, or rather quite contrary to my reading of Orwell, what I did develop was I've touched on it a moment ago, really, a strong sense of there being millions of people in Britain who must be just as clever as everybody else, but who are never going to get into the positions that I was going to get into. The enormous wasted talent, this great reservoir of ability, who had not a complete glass ceiling, because, of course, public grammar school boys and others broke through quite a lot, but it was very much more difficult for them to be taken seriously because of the way they spoke and because of the way they'd been to school. And I don't know if you'd call that chippy, but I've always felt a faint sense of indignation about it.
Well, no, that's not chippy at all, is it? Because that's on other people's behalf.
Yes.
And the sense of it, a natural injustice that you describe.
Yes, well, I've not been the victim of it, so I've been lucky, but I can see that others are.
And still are, possibly.
Yes. Oh, still, yeah.
Possibly in reverse when it comes to some areas of mobility. And I mean, chippiness would be for some of your contemporaries from a grammar school or a similar background. They would be the ones that ramped up their accents by 5 notches and started wearing clothes that were not their natural habitat, and that desperation to fit in, which again, you see people talk mockingly about Margaret Thatcher's Cecils and Normans, don't they? And I only now understand why, because the Cecils and the Normans were not traditional toffs, and neither in many cases were they pretending to be. And for the traditional Tory party, I was only 7 in 79, so with the benefit I see now, this was a huge internal departure for the party.
Yes, and I experienced it pretty much firsthand, especially actually in my 2 years before she won the 79 election, when she was still the leader of the opposition and hadn't been for very long. And you always felt in her office under siege, and under siege not from the Labour Party, not even particularly from the media, but under siege from elements in the Conservative Party who said or whispered or implied, A, she's a woman, which is unheard of
course,
for a leader of the party. B, she went to grammar school, indeed a provincial grammar school, in Grantham. C, she studied chemistry. For God's sake, what have we done landing ourselves with this creature as leader of our party? What has happened to us? And even after she won the election, there was still that very strong undercurrent amongst a lot of people, and not just people on the right of the party, people on the left. There were lots of quite liberal grandees in the Conservative.
So what would their problem be? More the woman bit?
Misogyny and snobbishness, and class because of her education and background.
So you went to Yale after Cambridge on a scholarship.
Yes.
Presumably, you had a ball there, I imagine.
Yes, probably not in the way that those who awarded me the fellowship
the Paul Mellon
had
Fellowship.
hoped. It was a Paul Mellon Fellowship, and it was to study anything for 2 years.
God,
lots of
like a blank
$5,000 a year pocket money.
Wow.
And nobody even checked on my progress, which is lucky.
Yes.
Because I was supposed to be studying something called international relations that sounds interesting.
Yes, it does.
But turned into one of those American pseudosciences where we were feeding stuff into computers and looking for correlations. So I discovered Four Roses bourbon, which is the cheapest bourbon that was widely available. And I drank a lot of bourbon.
It's the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Yes. And I went to a lot of parties, and I hung around with Peter Ackroyd.
Okay.
He was one of the other Clare Mellon fellows there. And of course, Peter just went to parties all the time. He knew Andy Warhol. We went to the most wonderful parties, and I just kind of hung around like the slightly shy kid. And I got introduced to lots of people. I drank a lot of bourbon, and I had a very interesting time.
So educational, but not in the formal sense necessarily.
No. I think being gay was probably because I was not out at all. I had never met anybody really, and I didn't know what I was going to do about it. And looking back on it, I think I was having a sort of, not a midlife crisis, but a sort of early 20s.
Yeah, almost a pre-life crisis or pre-adulthood crisis. But so was that a gay milieu that you were moving in with Peter Ackroyd?
Well, Peter's friends certainly were.
Yes, I appreciate that. So,
whenever I talk about him, incidentally, on the radio, if I ever see him, he says, "Oh, I hear you've been talking about me on the radio. You've been a very bad girl."
I don't know if his orbit extends to podcasts yet, but you'll be the one to find out, won't you?
It'll be drawn to his attention.
And so back from Yale, a short hop, you before you ended up working for Margaret Thatcher, but you've touched on your personal life. Were you, comfortable with your sexuality upon your return to the United Kingdom?
Well, this is something I find a little difficult to explain. I have never been remotely uncomfortable with my sexuality. It's never occurred to me that there would be anything wrong or immoral or sinful. But until I was in my sort of late 20s, early 30s, I always assumed that it would be incompatible with any sort of career or any sort of achievement in
being
public life.
Being out, be incompatible with.
And so I formed the stupid early ambition to be completely celibate for the rest of my life, which didn't last quite as long as
did it last?
I'd hoped. But so that I wasn't. There was no inner turmoil about am I wicked or anything. But there was a very calculating turmoil about how am I going to be Prime Minister or whatever if I'm gay.
Could I describe that as lucky? I mean, the fact that you had that comfort and security.
Yes.
Well, because self-loathing for your generation of a right-wing gay man, self-loathing would be rather a large part of the personality.
With some, I think, and not with others.
Of course,
there were lots of kind of gloriously carefree.
Yes,
Tory
but you do.
gentlemen.
When you describe yourself, the word lucky, I thought, oh, what a lucky fellow that you felt that way, that you were not crippled by. Because I went to a monastic boarding school, so had I been gay, I imagine I'd have been carrying all sorts of crosses, metaphorically speaking.
Yes,
but the ambition big enough for you to think you'd be able to subsume not just your sexuality, but sex.
Yes.
In order to pursue the glittering prizes of public life.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's right.
And yet, well, let's now talk about how you ended up working for Margaret Thatcher.
Well, after 2 years in the Foreign Office, I realised I wasn't going to be any good at it.
And you didn't want to be a spy?
I didn't. Oh, yeah. No, I was interviewed for MI6 and offered a job as a spy.
Why didn't you fancy that?
I thought I'd never be able to keep my mouth shut. I also thought, I'm gay. And I thought, Burgess, Philby, McLean, this is not a good idea.
No, and they haven't really set you up for a storming entry into the service, have they?
So I went into the regular Foreign Office. Mind you, couldn't be gay in the regular Foreign Office either, but it was an instant dismissal.
Was it really?
At that time, it would have been, but I thought it's less dangerous.
Yes.
And I was no good at that. So, well, I was fine, but I'd have ended up as Consul General in Marseille or something. Definitely not ambassador in Washington. So I resigned, and a young chap called Chris Patton took me on. He was running the Conservative Research Department, and he sent me to work for Margaret Thatcher, answering her letters from the general public.
And your early encounters with her? Did she have a wing under which she could take people, and did she take you on?
No, she was... What you saw with Margaret Thatcher was exactly what you got. She was the same in the office as she would have been, I think, with her family at breakfast. She was completely unchanging. She was not warm. I don't think she had a lot of human warmth. She was not really very interested in other human beings on a personal level, but she was very straight with people, and she was very correct. And she knew that as an employer, she must be good to her employees. She must ask them how they were. If she discovered that their father, my father, had had a heart attack, she must take care to ask how he was. So she did all the right things. It didn't come with a lot of personal warmth, but I admired her. I admired her fixity of purpose. It's terrifically inspiring in any organisation to work for someone who knows what they are, who they are, what they want, where they're going, and where they want all the rest of the team to go. It's very inspiring.
Like Napoleon and Snowball.
Yes.
To start with. And did you shine in her office? Did you?
I did until I wrote a rude letter to a woman in a council house in Gravesend. She'd written to Mrs. Thatcher. And I intercepted all these letters. So we had up to, in 1 week, we had 5,000, but generally we were dealing with 500 or 600 a week. Yes.
Oh, good grief.
But her letter said she lived on a council estate. The people next door to had a child with Down syndrome. She didn't like to live next door to people with problem children. What was going to be done about that? Whoa. And the other side of her lived some Asian people, and she didn't know why she should live on an estate with Asian people. And what are you going to do about Mrs. Thatcher? Well, I was late and I was tired, and I just took an instant dislike to her, and I wrote on Mrs. Thatcher's headed notepaper, replying on behalf of the leader of the opposition, that this woman should be grateful to have a roof over her head provided at the ratepayer's expense. And we all write letters like that in our head.
Yes.
But you tear them up the next morning, or you don't press the send button.
Don't press send is the thing, isn't it?
I did. And to cut a long story short, the trade union movement got hold of the letter through this lady's husband. The Labour Party printed 3 million leaflets of the letter, and in the 1979 general election, they were delivered through the door of every council house in every marginal seat in Britain.
Without the original letter to which you were replying,
No, which
which would have
I'd love
provided,
to get it.
I was going to say, a bit of context.
Somewhere, yes.
Could have been helpful.
But Mrs. Thatcher's instinct, which was, as so often, unerringly right, was just apologise and shut up.
Yeah.
And so we all apologised and shut up, and unfortunately, Airy Neve was assassinated the following day, and that took us out of the news.
The news cycle moved on. Gosh, it's a brutal business, isn't it? Sometimes.
Yeah, so I let her down at the last.
Wow. I mean, it didn't stop you getting into Parliament in that year, did it?
Yes, it was too late for me to be...
Would you think you would have been... Were you in that much trouble?
Oh, yes. If I hadn't already been selected as a parliamentary candidate by the time this came to light...
Oh, boy.
And that would have been the end.
So this is a proper sliding doors moment, but the other way round.
Yes.
Who knows where you would have ended up if it... Because, I mean,
it would have been the end of me.
Yes. Out of favour.
Yes.
But you weren't. You went up as the MP for West Derbyshire.
Yeah, but that was good luck too, because it's one of the safest Conservative seats in Britain.
Which is why Peter Lilly and Michael Howard both wanted it in 79 as well.
That's right,
isn't it?
yeah. and I got it. The Conservative Party, they never tell you this when they campaign against the alternative vote, but they select their candidates by an antique version of the alternative vote system. And I got I was everyone's second choice. Half of them didn't like Peter Lilly, half of them didn't care for Michael Howard, half of them didn't care for a woman called Joan Varley, I think, because she was a woman.
Yes.
And nobody had any particular dislike of me, and I got in on second or third ballot.
and what was it like when you arrived in the House of Commons?
It's like what everybody says. It's like you're a new kid in a school and you just don't know what the rules are. I believe there are induction lessons now, but there were not then. And
back to then, the chaps in dressing gowns who would probably fit in fairly quickly straight away and start swapping anecdotes.
Yes, but
on your benches.
Even in 1979, the Parliamentary Conservative Party was amongst white males was a fairly good social mix. And there were hardly any women, and there were hardly any people of colour. But there were lots of grammar school boys, and the upper classes did not dominate the Conservative Party. Indeed, Mrs. Thatcher had just become their leader.
And you were open about your sexuality from the start? I mean, were you the first? No, I was going to say.
I wasn't.
Later.
I managed to get selected without telling any lies.
Okay, so no one ever asked you.
In Derbyshire, we're very polite and we don't ask people questions like that. And indeed, no one ever has asked me in Derbyshire. And they didn't at the selection meeting. So, but they did have the impression that I had a girlfriend.
And you didn't disabuse them of the notion. I did not
disabuse them of the notion, I'm afraid. But in order to atone, I have these little kind of negotiations with myself sometimes. In order to atone for that dishonesty by omission, I said that I would devote myself to the cause of homosexual equality once I was an MP. And I did, right from the start.
Oh, I see. Without declaring your vested interest
I think
in it.
after a while,
I think became a bit suspicious when I picked this particular project.
I tried to come out in about 1983. It's what everybody says is true, that if you want to keep a secret, make a speech in the House of Commons just before midnight. And I did, on an order which extended the decriminalisation of homosexuality to Northern Ireland. And I made a speech in which I said this subject was extremely close to my heart. And I had reason to know that it was a wonderful thing that we were doing, and that it affected me so deeply and so personally that whereas passionate feeling might normally give wings to somebody's oratory, I found myself unable to say anything more than that I commended the measure with all my heart and sat down. And I thought, this is my coming out speech. Yes. But nobody noticed.
So you sat down and waited for the fanfares.
I had lovely letters from Jim Pryor and other people congratulating me on my courage. But
no, well, Kevin Mackenzie was in the chair at the Sun by then, so you could have had a much less pleasant experience than ambivalence.
I did have a call from the Sun the next day saying, what are you trying to say? And I said, read the speech. Yes. That's all I'm going to say. And they didn't take the risk. Had it been the Daily Mail, they'd have taken the risk.
Confounded them. it didn't live up to your expectations, politics? Is that fair to say?
I'm not sure I lived up to politics' expectations.
50-50.
You've got to be part of a gang. Well,
Right.
Theresa May wasn't, but then that's probably her downfall.
Yes.
I think if I were to go back into it now, I would realise you have to find a group and you have to join the group and you have to be prepared to subsume some of your own bees in your bonnet in order to stick with the group. And I didn't. I was a bit of a lone wolf. I'm not specially clubbable.
And not particularly interested in a career as a lone wolf, because Parliament does allow for that, doesn't it?
Yes.
I mean, on both sides.
Yeah,
of the house,
I didn't want to
plenty
be a kind of veteran backbencher, a brave introducer of wild private members' bills and things like that. I wanted to be a cabinet minister.
Right.
And I was actually offered a job as the PPS, which is to say the bag carrier,
Yes.
the kind of first rung on the ladder to Patrick Jenkin, who was the Secretary of State for Health and Social Security. It was a huge department in those days. And he offered me the job, and of course I was delighted. And then I thought I'd better tell the Chief Whip directly about myself, or I'm just going to get into telling bigger lies and bigger lies. So,
because by now celibacy hadn't worked out for you.
it hadn't worked out, no, I'm afraid to say. It hadn't worked out in a big way. And
Stop showing off.
I was invited by the Oxford Union to propose the motion, "This House is glad to be gay." I thought, this is my moment.
Yeah.
So I wrote a speech to the Oxford Union that really made it quite clear I was gay. And I took my draft speech to the Chief Whip and then said, look, I've been asked to be a PPS and I want to be, but you should know that I'm about to make this speech to the union. And he said, look, he gave me a whiskey. I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone before. He said, I don't believe in God. He said, but I don't feel the need to stand up in the pew in church and shout, I don't believe in God. I don't tell my family, my congregation, I don't believe in God. Have another whiskey. And that was his way of saying, no problem with us, mate, but, would you just shut up about it?
Right.
But that was the Tory attitude. It had its kind of tolerance to it,
Yes.
but it wasn't good enough for me. And the offer of the job was withdrawn straight away.
Oh, was it really?
Yeah.
It was that brutal.
So that was the end of my career.
And because that pulled the ladder away from you, you had, as you said, no interest in staying. So journalism, was that the obvious path to follow? In 86 you came out of it.
I did, yes. I'd done a bit of journalism and it had gone very well. And I'd done some television journalism living on the dole in Newcastle as an MP
and
for
you ran out of money.
And running out of money.
Having approved of the
ban.
ban.
Thatcher's fury.
£26.80
yes.
in 1984.
Right.
Having said, a bit like Ian Duncan Smith, it would be no problem at all to live on this sort of money.
Right.
And then lo and behold, you couldn't pay the electricity. You couldn't have no
Mrs. T
coins
asked
left.
me how I could possibly have failed.
Yes.
She said, you could have kept one in a library, she said. Anyway.
Yeah, interesting. I don't know, it might have been worse than running out of money.
It might
for
have
the
been good
electricity
advice.
meter.
But anyway, so I had some exposure, media exposure, and I got a phone call from Weekend World, which was LWT's equivalent of the Andrew Marr programme, ITV's equivalent.
Brian Walden.
They wanted me to replace Brian Walden. I heard myself saying yes before I'd even realised that I wanted to quit Parliament. And
Good grief.
so then began another failure in my life.
Well, you say that, and I mean, it's not a part of your career I know a great deal about. How quickly did you arrive at the conclusion that it wasn't working?
As with being a backbench MP, there is never a moment when you realise it isn't
No,
working.
of course.
And you are aware of lots of people for whom it didn't work for years and years, and then it did.
Yes.
And there are often reasons for hanging on. And I did hang on with the Weekend World, but I did know our ratings were dropping, and I did know that we'd lost the profile that we had under Brian.
You stepped into enormous shoes, of course, but you knew that.
Well, I think I only knew how enormous they were
when you got
the
them on.
feet didn't fit.
Touch the toes.
As it were. Yes, yeah.
Cotton wool, I think we use at home.
The programme actually was a bit obsolete.
Right.
It had outlived its format, but it had been kept going by that man's sheer talent and personality, and I didn't have that.
And contacts as well.
Yes.
He'd be pulling in.
Yeah, he was very. Yeah.
beasts. And so then a sort of gentle segue into print journalism as opposed to...
Well, a sort of lurch, because we were axed. The programme was axed. I was axed. I was out of a job, no pension, nothing, and a big mortgage.
Yeah.
And the editor of the Times asked if I would like to... That was 7 editors ago. Asked if I would like to write
Which one was that?
It was Charlie Wilson.
Right. Okay.
Who was the survivor of the riots and Wapping and all that kind of thing. Asked if I'd like to write just a little few paragraph thing, amusing, about the day's proceedings in Parliament. I thought a bit of a come down, but I need the money in it. It just went really well. And after that, everything got better. But I was 39 by then.
Were you really?
Yes,
For that next chapter? That kind
yes.
of, well, that's fascinating. And that is the path that you're still on now, really. And it's why I very straight-faced use the word hero to describe my own personal view of you, journalistically speaking. And I've never been entirely sure why, because I have a much clearer picture now of why I feel, as someone who leans more perhaps to the left, or thought that left and right meant things that in the last 3 or 4 years they've been shown not to mean anymore. So what you were saying about feeling that other people are being denied opportunity, I think I would, as a younger, lazier thinker, I'd have described that as a left-wing perspective.
Yes.
But of course it's not.
No, it isn't. I mean, for instance, in the Conservative Party, Michael Gove would feel that even more passionately than me, although in many respects you'd put him on the right of the party.
Yes. Equality of opportunity is not the same as equality of destination.
Yes. Yeah.
I knew this was going to happen. We've got very little time left to discuss the current political landscape, to which we both contributed our sterling, a full weight of support,
and we
various Remain or tactical voting. I mean, you did leave your party. You left the Conservative Party and urged other Conservatives to do the same.
Yes.
I read your columns religiously, so I know that was not a decision taken lightly.
No.
And is it one you regret?
No.
Not at all?
No.
Would you go back?
No, I wouldn't. I'll never forgive the Conservative Party for taking Britain out of the European Union. But, that's for me personally. Other people will make their own decisions. And, the party will in the end become something that has outgrown the Brexit row. And then people will have to look at which way it's going and whether it's worth joining. But I'm enjoying being out of the tribe now.
It's quite liberating, isn't it? It's that sense.
It is.
If you were operating under a sense of duty, more perhaps to protect others again than to protect your own interests, because you're going to be all right, regardless.
Yes.
But you feel that other people perhaps don't realise how bad it might be for them.
Yeah.
That sense, having done your duty and failed, it's a curiously liberating.
It is liberating, but it's also very dislocating. You don't realise, one doesn't realise until one has left a party of which one has been a loyal member for most of one's life. One doesn't realise how it's got into your bloodstream and how your whole life is now associated with the party, and how you say we interchangeably with the Conservatives. I keep saying we, and I keep having to remind myself it's not we any longer.
Gosh.
And so many of my friends, most of whom are still my friends. But
I was going to ask, did you have any fallings out as a result of your... None at all?
No, none at all.
I suppose because you weren't alone, were you? I mean, there were a number of prominent Conservatives in Parliament, not never mind
some
without.
Of the best, yes.
Some of the very best. And that's when I felt genuinely, completely bamboozled by what was going on. When people like Soames were being essentially shown the door by the Conservative Party, and all of the Brexit rhetoric should have delivered, a suit of armour to Winston Churchill's grandson, and yet it just seemed for a brief period last year that, the chaos you described as what happens if everybody is allowed to do whatever they want, it kind of briefly seemed poised to engulf the Conservative Party.
Yeah, yes, it did, and a lot of the clever clogs now are saying, although we thought it was a bit extreme expelling them all then, in fact, the Chief Whip needed to crack his whip, and it has established the Prime Minister's predominance over his party. And yes, it has in the short term. But for a party like the Conservative Party, with the respect that it ought to feel for its elders, to treat people to whom it owed so much in that way, I think is a stain that will take a long time to be removed.
It depends, I suppose, who they're wooing, because it would take a long time to remove it in your eyes.
Yes.
But some of the new voters they secured on the back of the Brexit rhetoric and the Brexit movement possibly quite enjoy that brutality.
Yes.
Almost admire that sanctioned bullying. You see it with Trump, and now perhaps you see it with Johnson.
I think you're probably right that with the passing of time, the waters will close over the heads of the 21 or whatever, and everyone will forget who they were. But it isn't just the way they've been dishonoured, as it were. It's it's the contribution that their part of the party played in defining what conservatism is, and that has been wrenched out of the party.
And I hadn't understood that properly until today. And that it is a lot to do, oddly, given that she's held up by Eurosceptics as something of a patron saint. It's a lot of the Thatcher legacy that you feel has been excised from the party's
it has.
body politic.
Completely so. You can't just wrench part of a party's history away.
Well, she took the original decision to pool sovereignty. It was a calculation that she made and decided was in the national interest. And that single observation was missing from the entire debate.
Yeah, completely.
Final question, Matthew Parris. What are you watching most closely? Is it Brexit related? Is it Boris Johnson related? Politically, what are you watching most closely now? Because we've all been watching the 2016 results so closely for the last 3.5 years, you can almost forget what you wrote about or what you talked about before.
Yeah, and I was rereading some of it, and it's all just nonsense now. You can line the budgie cage.
There's not going to be many volumes of collected journalism of the Brexit years, is there?
No.
For winners or losers, I don't think.
No, the anthology will not find many readers.
So what are you watching most closely?
I'm watching the consequences of Brexit rather than Brexit's going to happen quite soon.
Yes.
But I think two kinds of vassalage face us, either vassalage to the United States or vassalage to the European Union, where we have to go along with it, but we're not part of it any longer. And I don't think that has entirely dawned on the British people yet, but I think it will in the year ahead.
The country they claimed we already were,
while
trying to persuade us to vote for Brexit, seems set under that reading to become... We will become that country after all.
Yes, yeah.
Not ready yet to appreciate the irony of that.
No, they're not.
Nor am I. I'm going to finish with something that I think I may have told you before, but I don't think anybody else listening to this will be aware. But about 10 years ago, when I was plying my trade on LBC and getting very frustrated, in quite an arrogant way, about the fact that nobody seemed to be noticing the work that I was doing, and I was pretty sure I was doing good work. And my father-in-law, who had a minicab at the time, was driving you back from Sky News, and he had me on the radio. And you said to him, "Who's this chap?" And my father-in-law turned up the volume without announcing his personal connection. He said, "This is LBC, it's a chap called James O'Brien." And you said some very nice things about me, which he immediately phoned and reported to me. So
really?
Really. So it's all your fault that I'm still on the radio.
Well, they would have been meant, because I didn't know it was your father-in-law.
Clearly not. Thank you so much for that. But also, thank you so much for this, Matthew Parris. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Full Disclosure. Don't forget to rate it and indeed subscribe to the whole series on Global Player or wherever you get your podcasts. Do join me for the next episode, and until then, goodbye.